and influenza travels the globe every single year. So influenza is completely reliable. It's a plague of humankind every year and kills many hundreds of thousands of people every year. In a bad year, it can kill millions of people. We've learned to live with influenza, and we hope that we don't have the pandemic strains, the ones that are most severe, more lethal. We had such a strain in the swine flu 2009. We also had it in 1968, 1957. And the most famous was 1918, 1919, which infected between 30 and 100 million people, killing tens of millions of people around the world. So coronaviruses, which are thought of as bat viruses, there are over 200 strains, and they have infected humans. There are coronaviruses that cause mild disease in children. So we know that coronaviruses can be adapted to children, to humans, I should say. And then we have the SARS experience. So SARS, a novel coronavirus and one that had not been seen in humans before, jumped into humankind. And again, we think it was bat origin because that's the natural host of the coronaviruses, but they can leap into vertebrate animals. And a disease that leaps from vertebrate animals to humans is called a zoonosis. So this is a zoonosis. And we learned from SARS that it could be transmitted human to human, but the SARS coronavirus was not as efficiently adapted to humans as the childhood coronaviruses are, and did not survive the seasonal shift in 2004. So it died out in the summertime and did not recur in the next season. Then we had MERS, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, and even more lethal than SARS, extremely lethal, but no, it didn't transmit efficiently person to person. Then finally, we have the current coronavirus, the so-called SARS COVID-2 virus, and then the disease we refer to as COVID-19. So the SARS-CoV-2 virus turns out to be as efficiently spread in humans as influenza, or possibly even a little bit better, and much more lethal than influenza typically is, probably 5 to 10 times more lethal, and not as lethal as SARS or MERS, but still worse than influenza. So introducing this new virus to humankind is a terrible thing, especially since its greater infectiousness may keep the cycle going all year round. We're not at all sure that it will die out in the summertime, because you know that the southern hemisphere has the inverse seasons as the northern hemisphere. So perhaps it dies out a little bit in the temperate climate northern countries like China or U.S., Europe, Iran, but perhaps it surges in Australia, in Chile, Argentina, etc. So then it can be reintroduced. Another possibility is that we don't really snuff it out in the summertime. We have a second wave. As people start going back to work, then we see a second wave. So there are great concerns about this new coronavirus. We would be very happy to rid it from humankind, but it's taken an extremely strong foothold in 200 countries. And we see local transmission everywhere we look. No matter which country we look at, we see local transmission person to person. So this is why we're taking this so very seriously. It had done great damage in Wuhan and had emerged in Daegu, South Korea. We were just getting early information about a few cases in Iran that looked worrisome. So we thought that given the ease with which this virus had traveled from the Wuhan epicenter, that it could travel anywhere. And so we discussed the importance of surveillance and aggressive public health response. We talked about the need to develop drugs and vaccines. And we talked about the use of modern molecular pharmacology in which the virus coat, the envelope of the virus, could be the structure of that virus, which has been characterized with X-ray crystallography, that we could look at those spikes and other characteristics of the virus, and using molecular techniques and data sciences, find drugs that already exist, that are perhaps already licensed, that might have a good lock and key fit with the virus, or other intrusive features between the virus and viral entry. And there are scientists around the world, a friend of mine, Mark Dennison at Vanderbilt University, and others who have been studying coronaviruses for many years. And we thought that perhaps existing drugs might be discovered through modern data sciences. Pharmaceutical chemists might modify these drugs slightly, or perhaps just use the drugs that exist. And this is what's being done now with some success. We've identified a few drugs that a couple of them are biological agents, monoclonal antibodies. A couple of them are antiviral agents used for influenza, and those are in clinical trials now. Virus did come to our city, to New Haven, Connecticut. We are located about halfway between New York City and Boston, and we're right on the Amtrak train line, and one of the principal stops of that train line. We're also right on a heavily trafficked thoroughfare, the so-called Interstate 95, which goes all the way from New England to Florida and connects New York City and Boston, a very heavily traveled route. So we were not surprised that when the virus emerged in the state of Washington and in California, and then ended up in New York City and resulted in a huge outbreak, the worst outbreak anywhere in the world. It didn't surprise us that it would come to New Haven, and we tried to get ready for it with ramping up of personal protective equipment for our healthcare workers and plans for contact tracing. We hoped to have access to testing, but that has been very slow to come. And then mobilizing for the physical distancing, the hygiene campaigns, hand washing hygiene campaigns, the travel restrictions that have been tried elsewhere in the world. So we can look at the rest of the world. We can see what worked well and what didn't work so well. So two of the examples we've looked at are Wuhan, China, and Daegu, South Korea, where although they had terrible outbreaks with a lot of human suffering and even death, they were able to get their local spread under control. So how did they do that? They did that with rigorous travel restrictions, with physical separation, with a lockdown of society for a number of months, with hygiene campaigns, with aggressive use of personal protective equipment and universal mask use. And we saw a high degree of success in both venues. So this gave us a model. They were less aggressive in Iran, in Italy, and in Spain in their response, and they paid a terrible price with much more transmission than we would have liked to see. So we did not have a travel lockdown. We didn't cordon off New York City and deny people entry and exit the way they did in Wuhan. So we did not achieve the efficiency of control. We were also very late to mask use. Since we had a shortage of personal protective equipment for healthcare workers, we didn't have enough N95 and surgical masks. We ran out. Then it was deemed that we should reserve these high quality masks for healthcare workers. And some of us were arguing that the dust masks, the hobby masks that you can buy at the hardware store that workers use, or homemade masks that use a dense fabric, would be a reasonable thing for citizens to use. But some people argued against us. They said that there wasn't a sufficient evidence base that these masks worked well. So we had these debates, these academic debates. And I was a pro-mask advocate. I felt that some protection was better than no protection. And I believed that stochastically or probabilistically, one would reduce droplet exposure using a mask, even if some of the aerosolized tinier fractions might get through the mask. I still thought that one would reduce infection risk, but not everybody agreed with me. Finally, CDC did change its recommendation to recommend mask use. But, you know, in Asia, mask use is very popular because of air pollution in some of the big cities, and people are used to wearing masks. So they wore masks right away and with high degree of fidelity. And I would have loved for us to do the same. Even today, I went out to buy some food yesterday, and everyone was practicing physical distancing, and probably 80% of the people were wearing masks. But 20% of the people were not wearing masks. And we're in the peak of our coronavirus transmission. Just this last week has been our peak. We've had over 400 people in our hospital with coronavirus, and 100 of them have been in the ICU, and over 70 of them have been on a ventilator. And you would think that at the peak of coronavirus transmission in a small city like ours, that people would take this more seriously. So these measures help control the virus if they are adhered to. If they're not adhered to, then you have chinks, and you have chinks in your armor. You have holes, and you have the possibility of people continuing viral transmission cycles. So I personally would wish that the U.S. had more social discipline, if you want to call it that way, where we all agree to do something and we all do it. For example, we should all drive safely, in our cars. Yeah. We should not litter on the streets. We should take care of each other and watch out for each other. And that part of that is to adhere to these epidemic control measures. But unfortunately, we drive too fast. Some people drive through red lights. People are not necessarily, they litter, and they're not necessarily helping each other. So we are a little bit of an undisciplined society, and we pay a price for that at a time of a pandemic. 2 million symptomatic cases that were diagnosed easily translates into 10 to 15 to 20 million cases We don't think that more than 10 or 15% of these cases were symptomatic and serious to come to the attention of a hospital, for example, and actually getting tested. So that could easily be 15, 20 million people infected. I know that there are big surveys in Wuhan going on, in Italy and Spain. So within just days, I hope, we will have much better information on the degree to which the virus has penetrated populations. In some areas, it may only be 1%. In other areas, it may be 5%. In the most heavily afflicted areas, perhaps it will be 15 to 20%. If there were no interventions, it might have gone much higher. The novel coronavirus, is probably at least as infectious as influenza. And influenza has no trouble staying alive and circulating the planet year after year after year after year. Mm-hmm. So I am cautiously pessimistic that the novel coronavirus may do the same. And even if we have some seasonality where the virus, similar to other respiratory viral infections, is not as vigorous in the warmer, moister time of year, it may still continue circulating in smaller pockets, and therefore may emerge when the season is friendlier, the cooler, drier time of year, and when people are indoors more. And also, I mentioned earlier the southern hemisphere and the ease. Once we're back to normal, global travel for business and pleasure will surge, and there will be more north to south transportation and travel. So I believe that we will see a decline. We're already seeing it. Wuhan hasn't had a case for weeks. And we think we might be peaking in the state of Connecticut, where I live. New York seems to have peaked. So we do expect a downward trend. There seems to be a downward trend in Iran, in Italy, possibly in Spain. We're not sure yet. So at the end of the day, we will see a decline, but can we snuff out all of the transmission in a country as large as the US, as large as China, continent of Europe? That remains to be seen, and it's plausible that we will have trouble doing so. I can tell you that other RNA viruses mutate at high rates. HIV is a good example. This coronavirus is a large RNA virus, but still the characteristics of RNA viruses and the way that they enter cells and multiply within the cells, we call them retroviruses because they have to go through a step to create sort of two strands from their one strand of their RNA, and that's how they can integrate with the DNA of the host cell. So in this process, there can be a lot of mutation. Already, I've read several papers showing enough mutation of the coronavirus that they're detecting different strains, and they're able to use this to track spread with the viral characteristics. For example, there was some mutation from the migration of the virus from Asia to Europe. And most of the virus that emerged in the US seemed to have the molecular signature of the European viruses, not the Chinese viruses. So probably the spread was sort of east to west, more than west to east. But we have both viruses circulating, European strain, Chinese strain, but the European strain seems to be the biggest impact in the US. So at least we know there's enough mutation so that we can characterize the virus origin. And we can use that for epidemiologic purposes to track the virus, so-called phylogeny. However, we don't have any idea whether this influences immune responses. And are we going to have cross-reacting immunity? The changes in the virus don't seem to be as profound as they are for HIV. So we're hoping that the viral mutations in the coronavirus won't influence our ability to protect against the virus with a vaccine. We're hoping to develop one vaccine for all the coronaviruses, but that may be impossible. We may have to have a cocktail of vaccines, much the way we do for influenza, where we typically have 3 different antigens in the influenza vaccine for 3 different strains of flu. Polio vaccine historically had to have 3 to cover the 3 types of polio. And so, you know, we hope we're going to be lucky and have something like measles, where one vaccine is good for the whole world. But we may not get that lucky, and we may have to have a polyvalent vaccine, meaning multiple antigens in the same vaccine. So we'll see. This is what will be emerging. And this is why there's some question whether people who are seropositive for the IgG on the blood test are truly protected against coronavirus reinfection. Mostly, when you're seropositive for viruses, you are protected against reinfection. But that's not always true. And it may definitely not be true if there are different viral strains. For example, dengue virus has 4 clearly different strains, and protection against one does not protect you against the others. So there are examples where we can be optimistic. Most people with antibody are protected from reinfection, but we don't know that for sure. There was a lot of attention paid to hydroxychloroquine, which is a drug used to treat certain strains of malaria, and also it has anti-inflammatory effects, such that it's been used for autoimmune diseases like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. There are some conflicting results from studies. There was a study done in France that was not well designed, and even the journal that published it has now published a caveat saying that the study was not up to their standards. So we think that that's not reliable results. And then there are a couple of studies from China and one from the US. The one from the US is most worrisome. It showed that people treated with hydroxychloroquine did worse than patients who didn't get the drug in a randomized controlled trial. So I don't believe that we have any evidence of a drug that will work. A big study from China using antiretroviral drugs did not show an effect. There are many prospects and many trials going on right now, but we don't have the results yet. Personally, I'm cautiously optimistic. I feel that there is a strong scientific rationale for the use of several of these agents: monoclonal antibodies, other antiviral drugs, what we call convalescent serum, which is you harvest the antibodies from recovered patients, make sure there's no virus in there, and then you infuse that into very sick patients to give them passive immunity, immediate assistance in fighting off the virus. So all of these things show promise, and it's very plausible that if we have a surge of coronavirus, say next winter, from the Northern Hemisphere's point of view, perhaps we will have a stronger armamentarium of therapies. And that may help us keep society more open, because I think everybody knows that we can't keep society open, closed indefinitely. The economic devastation to the world is going to cause tremendous hardship and ill health. So we don't want to protect against coronavirus and then harm with global economic devastation. People losing their jobs, losing their livelihoods, losing their small businesses. You know, there's harm and there's harm. So what we need to do is have a balanced risk assessment, where when we bring society back to normal, we have the tools to mitigate death and severe illness with treatments. People talk about vaccines, but honestly, I think there's a lot of nonsense being talked about vaccines. It's going to take a while. To say that we're going to have a vaccine by the end of the year, it would be unprecedented. We've never achieved this with any other vaccine. We have to make sure the vaccine's safe. We have to make sure that it's plausibly effective in small human trials and in animal studies. And then we have to test it in large human studies. We may be able to do challenge experiments in animals that help us. There's even talk of doing challenge experiments in humans, which historically has been done, but is seen as perhaps unethical in the modern era, because, you know, to deliberately expose somebody to the virus. But if we got an answer fast, and if we took a low-risk individual and they knew the risk they were taking, we might get an answer faster, and that might be more ethical in the long run. I think the ethicists and the vaccinologists will be debating this in the very near future. One of the fastest vaccines that was ever developed was about 4 years turnaround time. And with a highly motivated global scientific and regulatory community, if we were lucky at every single step, maybe we could have a vaccine in 18 to 24 months. But that would mean that everything went very well. That would mean that we had no enhancing immunity. We've seen immune enhancement where the vaccine actually caused more severe disease in dengue vaccines, and also in respiratory syncytial viral vaccines for a very serious disease of infants. And so if that were to happen with coronavirus, we don't want to use that vaccine because it would do harm. So we have to make sure that it's safe, that it results in protective immunity, not enhancing immunity. And so this takes some time. There's no way around it. So I don't believe that we can stay shut as a society until we have a vaccine. I think we'll have to open up as a society as the viral frequency goes down. I hope that we'll have reliable tests and in adequate supply so that contact tracing and testing can help us sort people by their serological status and their exposure status. So yes, people will still be quarantined at home, but not as many of them. Yes, people will be able to go back to work, but they'll be well informed about their status. And then if we have the drugs that can assist, then we can open up society again, I think, more liberally than before. How do we avoid these catastrophic emerging infections that risk the kind of pandemic threat that this coronavirus has represented? First of all, there is primary prevention. How do we avoid the viruses coming into humankind to begin with? And the closer that humankind comes to the natural parts of the world, the more likely we are to have zoonotic emergence. For example, HIV jumped into humans in a big way, probably in Central Africa with persons who hunted great apes. And those hunters most likely infected themselves when they processed the meat, cutting up the animal for meat, and they might have had cuts on their hands, and they might have inoculated their hands, and then because the virus could be spread sexually and could be spread blood to blood, then it spread around the world and caused the great HIV/AIDS pandemic, which has killed more than 32 million people in the last 40 years. So that was originally a zoonosis. And then SARS was a zoonosis, and the novel coronavirus, the COVID-19 disease, is caused by is a major. So we're seeing this on a regular basis, catastrophic spread around the world of viruses that have emerged from wild animals. And I think that there are several reasons for this. Number one, we have a global population explosion. When I was a boy in the 1950s, there were 2.4 billion people on Earth. Now there are 7.7 billion people. And that's just in my lifetime. In the lifetime of my children, there will be 10 billion people on Earth. So we are pressing against the rainforests. We're pressing against the natural environments just because of our pressure and our demand for food. We're chopping down forests for grazing areas and for farms. And we're creating tremendous pressures on Earth. Second of all, climate change is resulting in a diminishing space for humans. For example, we have the phenomenon of desertification. So the deserts are growing each and every year. Hundreds of kilometers of grazing areas and farm areas are being consumed by deserts where we don't have enough water to irrigate. So we're expanding deserts and pushing populations into more crowded areas. And I believe that this also is going to accelerate population density and proximity to the natural world and risk to the population. And a third risk that's related to population pressures and global warming is the loss of species diversity. So we have the world reefs in the oceans dying, being bleached from acidification and warming. Well, this is radically altering the ecology of the oceans, and we already see overfishing and shifting of fish populations. And when people can no longer fish for a living, they're going to try to make their living off the land. The land is already pressured. So the combination of global warming, overpopulation, and loss of species diversity, I believe, is going to create tremendous pressures and is going to accelerate the probability of viral and other diseases emerging from vertebrate animals and coming into humans. So I think the world ought to use this historic event of the coronavirus, which seems to me to be a combination of the pandemic in 1918 and 1919, because of how widely spread and how efficient it is, with the Great Depression. And if there are two events that are more dramatic in the 20th century than those, I'd like somebody to tell me what they are. Perhaps only the Holocaust would compete with that sort of drama of what devastation has happened to the earth in the 20th century. And the 21st century could be much worse because we have so many more people on earth. We have such a serious crisis of global warming that the world is not taking seriously and is not remediating adequately. And this crisis of the loss of species diversity and the severe alteration of ecological relations between animals that have gone on for centuries are being severely altered now. So I feel that this should be a wake-up call to the world for these broader issues. If we have the threat of pandemic influenza and we fail in primary prevention, then we have to think about secondary prevention. How do we minimize the spread of the virus? And tertiary prevention, how do we care for the people who are sick from the virus? So we have to learn from all the mistakes we've made in this cycle. So we did not have adequate means to protect our healthcare workers. We had a shortage of PPE, and we also did not know much about whether the expiration dates of our masks were really legitimate. People were not using expired masks. It's possible those masks were perfectly fine. We were not sterilizing masks. It's possible that the use of the aerosolized hydrogen peroxide is going to be a superb way to reuse masks. We didn't have proper access to gowns, and we have to research gown reuse. Perhaps we can reuse gowns with sterilization. We had too few ventilators at very high cost. We had to build them in a frantic effort rather than have them in a stockpile that could be brought out to respond to a pandemic. We've also had the scandal in the United States of having discovered that we had major government contracts for mass production of N95 masks, and the contractors learned how to manufacture these masks in bulk, so they could have produced hundreds of thousands of masks per week. But then we never produced them. We learned how to do it, but we never did it. And we never stockpiled them. We also had a scandal of a ventilator contract with a company that was subsumed by another company. Well, the other company made expensive ventilators, and they were probably not motivated to continue a government contract to make lower cost ventilators. So no ventilators were manufactured. Millions of dollars were spent by the US government to get ventilators, but they weren't produced, nor were they purchased elsewhere and stockpiled. So we were unprepared. When I was in Shanghai about 10 or 12 years ago, I visited an infectious disease hospital in Shanghai that is out near Pudong, and it's far from downtown. And it was newly constructed after the SARS epidemic to have better capacity. And I was so inspired to see a very large field. And it looked just like a field, and they mowed it, and I thought perhaps it was a small park just to have it pleasant. But I didn't see park benches, and they told me it was the tent hospital. And they showed me the underground caps, and when they took off the cap, there was a line for oxygen, there was a line for water, there was a line for electricity, multiple lines, and they also had a cap for sanitation and a different cap. So underground, they had put all the infrastructure, and they told me that they had a tent in storage that could be mounted in about 6 hours with all of the connections, and they had beds in storage, so they could set up a tent hospital in 6 hours. Now, we did the same thing in the US. The Jacob Javits Convention Center, which is known to conventioners around the world who've come to the US for conventions. This is a very large convention center, but it wasn't prepared in advance to be a hospital. So at much higher cost, we were able to turn that into a temporary hospital. Similarly, we took the Navy hospital ships at very high cost to the New York Harbor instead of being prepared. And I was impressed that the religious organization Samaritan's Purse set up a tent hospital outside near Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan, in part of Central Park, and they were able to do that at very low cost. So I think, we have to learn from each other. We have to learn from Doctors Without Borders and Samaritan's Purse, the people who know how to mount field hospitals. The U.S. Army knows how to mount field hospitals, and the Chinese have developed these systems where they have plans where they can build a hospital in 2 weeks if they have to, or they can put a hospital up in 6 hours if they have to. So we need to teach each other how to do this. And the United States and the other countries, Italy, Spain, Iran, all around the world, have to have pandemic preparedness. So I'm frustrated because I've been doing infectious disease epidemiology for 40 years, and it's not uncommon that we know what to do, but we cannot get the resources to do it. And we write our reports, we do our scientific. So in some ways, I feel like a failure. I am not effective at communicating the urgency of these matters to the American voter. Global health has no borders. Think about the borders of the countries of the world. Sometimes there's a major river or an ocean or something, but so many of these borders are essentially arbitrary, and just lines are drawn, and they may be due to all sorts of wars or treaties or colonial conquests, and they're just easy to jump over these borders, easy to cross a river, easy to cross an ocean, easy to cross any sort of natural barrier. 95% of the people on Earth can visit the other 95% in less than 2 days. That's how well connected we are. And 2 days is well within the incubation period of practically every virus I can think of, or even bacteria or even parasites. So, ultimately, it's easy to transmit infectious agents. So we need to strengthen the hand of the World Health Organization to help it, help all of us. Over 200 countries in the world, we need the World Health Organization to be capacitated to, and the countries' ministries of health capacitated to address these issues and to cooperate and collaborate. That is the best way for us to see the control of global pandemics. We don't know the answer to that question. Will globalization and urbanization be affected by this outbreak? That is a speculation that I'm going to have trouble answering. I think we will probably rebound. I think urbanization and globalization are like the genies that have emerged from the bottle. It'll be hard to get them back in. But we can do urbanization much more intelligently. So there have been great architects who have thought about urbanization being more vertical to permit more natural land. Perhaps that's how we should build our cities, with more parks. Perhaps globalization can occur with less travel, with less stress on the less greenhouse gas stress on the earth. Perhaps we can use things like these social media platforms and these networking platforms online to do our business without as much travel. So I don't think that will diminish urbanization or globalization, but it may change how we do business.